Hey there, friends. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, I've got a story you're going to love. But before we settle in, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of these cozy tales. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It's always amazing to see our little storytelling circle stretch across the globe. Now dim those lights, get comfy, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. The beginning of time, around 3.3 million years ago. Let's go way, way back in time. So far back that there were no countries, no cities, and not even villages yet. There were no roads, no stores, and no internet. In fact, there weren't even humans like you and me. The earth was wild and free, covered in thick green forests, bubbling rivers, tall mountains, and wide open plains where animals roamed freely. Back then, creatures that looked a bit like us had just started walking on two legs. These early beings didn't know how to talk like we do now, and they didn't have any houses or clothes. But they were curious. They watched the world around them carefully. They listened to the sounds of the wind in the trees, the howls of distant animals, and the quiet rustling of leaves when something moved nearby. These early people, our ancient ancestors, were called Australopithecus. It's a long name, but it simply means southern ape in Latin. They lived in Africa, which is often called the cradle of humanity, because so many of our earliest ancestors came from there. Now, imagine waking up as one of these early humans. You don't have a bed. You probably slept under a tree or inside a cave with your small group. You stretch, open your eyes, and the first thing you do is look around for food. Hunger is always there. You don't have a fridge or a pantry. So your morning starts with a search, maybe picking some berries or digging up roots with your hands. Life was simple, but not easy. Everything depended on nature. If it rained too hard, you had to find shelter quickly. If the sun was too hot, you'd look for shade. If wild animals came too close, you had to run or climb a tree fast. Surviving every single day was the goal. But then, something changed. One day, one of these early humans picked up a sharp rock. Maybe they saw it lying near a riverbank. Maybe they watched how it could cut through a piece of fruit or meat. And just like that, something amazing happened. A simple idea sparked in their mind. This rock could be used as a tool. That moment was the beginning of the Stone Age. At first, tools were very basic. A sharp rock could cut, a heavy stone could break. But that was enough. It gave these early humans an edge, literally. They could use stones to open nuts, slice meat, dig in the dirt, or defend themselves from predators. It may not seem like much, but it was revolutionary. Up until then, people used only their hands, their teeth, and maybe sticks. But stone tools were stronger. They lasted longer, and they helped people do things faster and better. The interesting part is, these tools weren't made by accident. Early humans began to figure out how to make tools better on purpose. They chose certain kinds of stone, ones that were hard, but not too hard. They learned how to strike one rock against another to break off a sharp edge. That meant they weren't just surviving anymore. They were thinking. They were planning. That's a huge... Now let's step into their world for a moment. Imagine sitting near a river. You're holding a rock in one hand and hitting it with another. Small chips fly off. Eventually you're left with a tool that can slice through animal hide. Maybe your friends watch and learn. Maybe you teach your children. Slowly your group begins to understand how to survive better, together. During this time, communication was still pretty basic. No one spoke in full sentences like we do today. But they made sounds, grunts, clicks, hums, and used hand gestures. That might not sound like much, but it worked. It was enough to share simple ideas: food here, danger there, follow me. Over time, these sounds probably became more organized. Certain sounds meant certain things. That was the beginning of language. It's amazing to think that the words you're reading right now started from those early sounds by a river so long ago. So how did these early people live day to day? Most of the time was spent looking for food. They were foragers, which means they gathered fruits, seeds, and plants. When they could, they hunted small animals or ate meat from animals that had already died. They didn't farm. They didn't grow crops or raise animals. They took what nature gave. And when the food ran out, they moved. That's why early humans didn't stay in one place. They were always on the move, following the seasons, the rivers, and the herds. At night, they gathered in small groups. Maybe they sat around a fire, although fire wasn't something they had mastered yet at this point. More likely, they huddled together for warmth. They might have found shelter under large trees, rocky overhangs, or inside caves. Together, they were safer. They could look out for danger and help raise each other's children. This kind of life, roaming, gathering, surviving, went on for thousands and thousands of years. It may seem slow to us now, living in a world full of change and speed, but for them, every day brought new lessons. A new plant to taste, a new animal to watch, a new stone to test. Even without writing or books, early humans were learning all the time. They watched the stars. They noticed when animals traveled. They remembered where fruit grew. Their memories and shared experiences became the first kind of knowledge, and they passed it on, not through writing but through action. A child watched their parent gather roots. They learned which plants healed and which ones hurt. They saw how to hold a stone just right, how to throw a stick at a bird, how to find water when everything was dry. That kind of learning, person to person, generation to generation, was the beginning of human culture. Let's take a moment to appreciate how long this chapter of history really was. From the very first stone tools to more advanced ways of living took over 2 million years. That's not just a lot of time, it's almost all of human history. All of this walking upright, making tools, living in groups, learning from each other started in this early part of the Stone Age. We call it the Lower Paleolithic, which means the oldest part of the Old Stone Age. It's a time most people never think about, but it's where everything began. These people didn't have names we know. They didn't write books or build monuments, but they were the first to explore the wild earth with open eyes and wondering hearts. They were the first to ask, even in their own silent way, how can we live better? And they answered that question with every stone they shaped, every meal they shared, every path they walked. Even now, millions of years later, we carry a part of them inside us. The part that's curious, the part that the part that survives, no matter what. And that is where our journey through the Stone Age begins. The rise of Homo habilis, around 2.4 million years ago. So let's pick up where we left off. The world is still wild. The trees are thick and tangled. Rivers twist like snakes through endless plains, and the skies stretch far and open, untouched by rooftops or smoke. Time, as we know it, doesn't really matter here. What matters is survival. What matters is life. In this raw and untamed world, a new kind of human slowly walks into the picture. Not quite like us, but definitely closer than ever before. Their name? Homo habilis. It means handyman, and believe me, they earned that title. Now don't picture a guy with a toolbox and a hard hat. These folks still looked pretty primitive. They were short, maybe about 4 feet tall. Their arms were long, their faces a bit more ape-like than human. Their heads were small, and their brains weren't very big compared to ours. But they were different in a very important way. They were thinkers. For the first time, something big was happening inside the human skull. The brain of Homo habilis was a little larger than the ones that came before. That little bump in brain power changed everything. It meant better decisions, better memory, and better ideas. And better ideas meant better chances at staying alive. Let's step into their world. Imagine the early morning sun rising over the African savanna. The air is still cool from the night, but you can already feel the heat building. A small group of Homo habilis stretches their limbs, yawns, and starts the day. They don't have houses or tents. They sleep in places that feel safe, maybe in shallow caves, or under the shelter of thick trees. They sleep close together, bodies curled against the earth, their ears always alert to the sounds of rustling grass or distant growls. Danger is never far. One of them, maybe a young male named Ka, picks up a rock as he walks toward a riverbank. He studies it, turning it in his hand. It's not just a rock to him, it's something more. He remembers how his mother once used a similar rock to break open a turtle shell. So he tries it too. He finds a fallen nut and strikes it. Crack. The shell splits. The reward is sweet, creamy nut meat. Simple? Sure, but powerful. That rock just became a tool. The genius of Homo habilis was this. They didn't just stumble on tools, they started making them. They learned how to shape stones on purpose. They'd take one rock and smash it against another to break off sharp flakes. Those flakes became knives. The leftover stone, now with a jagged edge, became a chopper. These weren't fancy gadgets, but for early humans they were game changers. With stone tools, they could do things they'd never done before. They could cut meat from a carcass faster. They could smash bones to get to the fatty, rich marrow inside. They could dig deeper into the soil, maybe uncovering roots or tubers to eat. And that changed the way they ate. They weren't just eating fruit and leaves anymore. They were getting more meat, more fat, and more protein. That meant more energy, and more energy meant better survival. Food wasn't the only thing changing. Social life was evolving too. Homo habilis didn't live alone. They moved in small groups, maybe 10 to 20 people. Families, friends, old ones, babies. And in those groups, something else was growing. Connection. Picture them sitting together after a long day of foraging. Maybe they're gathered around a patch of dirt where someone is trying to crack open a bone. There's no language yet, not like ours, but there are grunts, clicks, and looks. Maybe someone passes a tool to another. Maybe a child watches, learning silently. Maybe someone shares a piece of meat. That's sharing, that's silent teaching, that's culture. With their growing minds, Homo habilis started solving problems together. They probably learned how to warn each other of danger. Maybe they started using certain sounds for certain meanings. A call for food, a cry for help, a growl for stay away. These early bits of communication were small steps, but they led to something huge later on. The birth of real language. Now life still wasn't easy. There were still leopards and lions, still sickness, still hunger. But Homo habilis was better equipped. Their hands were nimble, their brains were working, their hearts beat with something new, something close to hope. Imagine a hunt. Not a big one, they weren't chasing elephants just yet. But maybe they followed vultures and hyenas, watched for signs of a recent kill. When the bigger animals had eaten their fill and wandered off, the Homo habilis group would sneak in. They'd use their tools to slice and chop what was left. Organs, bones, marrow. It wasn't glamorous, but it was survival. And when it rained, they moved. When water dried up, they moved again. They followed herds, followed fruiting trees, followed the stories written in the land. Everywhere they went, they left tiny marks of their presence. Flakes of stone, broken bones, darkened spots where fires once burned. For us, millions of years later, those are the whispers of their lives. The clues that tell us who they were, what they did. We've found these clues buried deep in places like Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. Archaeologists dig carefully, brushing away the earth, and sometimes they uncover a stone flake, a tool shaped by hand. That small, sharp edge tells a story older than almost anything we know. And slowly, with every dig, every discovery, we piece together the life of Homo habilis. It's humbling, really, to know that long before kings and queens, before books and buildings, there were these small, clever humans carving out a life with stone and fire. Yes, fire. There's debate about whether Homo habilis truly mastered it or just used it when they found it, like from lightning strikes or natural wildfires. But the idea was there. Fire was becoming part of the human experience. It brought warm protection. maybe even a place to gather. At night in the flickering light of flames, they might have sat close, silent but aware, sharing food, sharing safety, sharing a life. Their world was still full of mystery. Storms came without warning. Animals attacked without mercy. Sometimes the land gave food, sometimes the land gave food, sometimes it did not. But they endured day by day, step by step, they kept moving forward. They didn't know it, but they were the bridge, the ones who came before us. Their hands shaped stone, their minds shaped ideas, and eventually, all of it would shape history. Because of them, our journey through the Stone Age didn't end, it just kept getting better. And that's where we leave them for now, these clever, careful ancestors, living their days under the vast African sky. They were the beginning of something big, something human, mastering tools and fire. Around 1.8 million years ago, time kept ticking along in that slow, ancient way it always did back then. 1,000 years could pass like a single breath in the rhythm of the earth. But even though it moved at a crawl compared to our fast-paced lives today, something important was happening. Evolution wasn't done yet, not even close. Out of the shadow of Homo habilis came someone new, someone taller, stronger, and even smarter. Enter Homo erectus. That name? It means upright man. And this new human ancestor really stood tall. Well, relatively speaking. They were still primitive by today's standards, but you would have noticed the difference if you saw one. Their legs were longer, arms shorter. They walked more like us, upright and confident, covering long distances on foot. Their skulls were thicker, faces still heavy with that ridge above the eyes. But their brains had grown. Not huge yet, but definitely better than before. And that growing brain? It opened up a world of possibilities. The first big leap, tools. Now you might be thinking, didn't Homo habilis already use tools? Yes, absolutely. But Homo erectus took tool making to a whole new level. Before, the tools were rough, sharp flakes, broken rocks, functional, but not very refined. But Homo erectus started shaping stones in more careful, consistent ways. They made what's called a hand axe, a teardrop-shaped piece of stone, flaked on both sides, with a nice, sharp edge. It was basically the Swiss Army knife of the Stone Age. You could cut meat, crack bones, scrape hides, dig up roots. One tool, many jobs. Imagine a small group of Homo erectus walking along a riverbank. The sun is high, and the land is golden with dry grass. One of them, let's call her Nari, kneels by a flat stone. She places a fist-sized rock on it, then smacks it hard with another. Tiny chips fly off. She turns it, strikes again, shaping it with a kind of quiet concentration. Another sits nearby, watching. That's how they pass down knowledge, by watching, repeating, improving. Over time, they got really good at it. They didn't have a word for teaching, but they were doing it. They didn't have blueprints or text, just hands, rocks, memory, and time. But tools weren't their only gift. This chapter in the journey has a second headline, a much bigger one. Fire. It's hard to say exactly when Homo erectus started using fire. Some say it happened around 1.5 million years ago, maybe earlier. But by 1.8 million years ago, there are signs, bits of burned wood, charred bones, and darkened earth that say something magical was happening. Now fire wasn't new to the earth. Lightning strikes had been sparking wildfires for millions of years. But fire in the hands of humans, that was new. At first, maybe it was just a curiosity. A storm rolls in. A bolt of lightning crashes into the grasslands. Flames erupt fast and wild. The group watches from a distance, nervous, wide-eyed. But after the smoke clears, they wander in. Something smells different. They find the body of a small animal, cooked by accident. The meat is softer, easier to chew. It tastes better. It sits more gently in the stomach. And that's the spark. From that point on, the idea is planted. Fire is useful. Fire is powerful. At first, they probably didn't know how to make it. They just used it when they found it, kept it alive by feeding it twigs and branches like a fragile pet. But over time, something changed. They learned to control it. Maybe they figured out how to keep coals smoldering through the night. Maybe someone discovered the trick of striking certain stones together to make sparks. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't fast, but it worked. And when fire became a part of their lives, everything changed. Nights once ruled by cold and darkness, now danced with warmth and light. The group could sit together longer. They could rest, cook, stay warm, and keep predators away. The fire wasn't just a tool, it was a center, a place to gather, a place to feel safe. It changed the way they ate too. Cooking made food easier to digest. It killed bacteria. It let them eat things they couldn't before. And the more energy they got from food, the more their brains could grow. Yup, fire may have literally helped fuel the evolution of human intelligence. Now imagine a typical evening. The sun dips below the hill. A group of Homo erectus gathers near the fire. The flames flicker and pop. Someone pokes at it with a stick. A baby dozes in its mother's arms. The smell of roasted roots and sizzling meat fills the air. No one speaks, not with real words, but their eyes meet, their hands gesture. Maybe someone pantomimes the story of a hunt. The others grunt and nod, understanding the tale without needing a single sentence. The fire is their theater, their classroom, their hearth. It's not hard to imagine that laughter existed even then, or sadness, or a kind of wonder. Around that fire, emotions found space to breathe. Minds began to wander beyond the immediate. What's out there? What's next? Homo erectus was a traveler too. They began to leave Africa, step by step, generation by generation. They spread into Asia, parts of Europe. Fossils have been found in places like Georgia, Indonesia, and China. And they didn't just stumble there. They moved with purpose, following rivers, coastlines, game trails. They adapted to new climates, new foods, new dangers. That ability to adapt, that willingness to try something different, was their real superpower. Of course, life was still brutally hard. Storms came, droughts hit, animals attacked, children were lost. But Homo erectus endured. They endured because of tools, because of fire, because of each other. And what's truly amazing, they lasted a long, long time. Hundreds of thousands of years, maybe over 1 million, longer than any modern civilization by far. That's something to think about. These weren't cavemen grunting in the dark. These were survivors, innovators, early explorers, and slowly they carved a path for others to follow. So as the embers glow and the stars wheel slowly overhead, we say goodnight to Homo erectus, the ones who turned rock into reason. The ones who tamed fire and turned night into home. They were the spark, and that fire still burns in us today. Life in the Middle Stone Age, around 300,000, 50,000 years ago. Time doesn't just pass, it reshapes everything. The mountains wear down, the rivers change their paths, and humans, they keep learning, keep adapting, keep becoming something new. By the time we step into the Middle Stone Age, or the Middle Paleolithic, it's like we've crossed another invisible line in the long journey of humanity. Homo erectus is still around in some places, but a new face is beginning to rise. A face that looks more like ours, a little less heavy in the brow, a little rounder in the skull, a little more aware, a little more human. Meet Homo heidelbergensis, a close cousin, and eventually the ancestors of both Neanderthals in Europe and Homo sapiens in Africa. These weren't primitive brutes. They were thinkers, hunters, fire users, tool makers. Life back then, still tough, still wild, but more complex now, more layered. The air was different too, not because of the atmosphere, but because of what it felt like. Something was shifting, something deep in the mind. Let's walk with them for a day. You wake up in a rocky shelter beneath a cliff, your back stiff from the cold. The fire burned low in the night, but didn't go out. That's important. Keeping fire alive takes real teamwork. There's always someone assigned to the embers. You step outside. The sun is barely touching the horizon. The world smells like smoke, damp earth and pine. A light mist drapes over the landscape. You don't see cities or roads or fences, just wide open land, untamed and vast. Herds of animals graze in the distance. Maybe mammoths, maybe antelope, maybe something strange. You're not alone. Your small group, 10, maybe 20 people is stirring too. They've all lived through the night together. They depend on one another. They share food, protect each other's children, and carry stories that no one writes down, but everyone remembers. The morning isn't for idle talk, it's for action. Hunger rules everything, so the hunters gather what they need. Spears are checked, long, straight shafts, tipped with stone points that were carved and shaped days ago. Some of the tips are glued on with natural resins and bound with sinew from previous kills. These are weapons that took planning, patience. This is where tools really start to evolve. In earlier times, tools were just chipped rocks. Now they've become more varied, more efficient. There are scrapers, awls, points, flakes. Every tool has a job, and each one tells a story of thought, of choice, of learning passed down from one generation to the next. The hunters move quietly. Every footstep matters. Wind direction matters. The animals out here are massive and dangerous. One mistake and you're the one being hunted. Meanwhile, back at the shelter, others get to work. There's no such thing as a lazy morning in the Stone Age. The fire has to be, water has to be collected, bones need to be shaped into needles or fish hooks. Animal hides are stretched and scraped, turned into clothing or coverings. Even the children help. They're not just playing, they're learning by doing. And above all this quiet activity is something new, something unseen. Thought, not just instincts, not just reactions, but real deliberate thought. Humans are starting to understand the world in ways they didn't before. You see it in how they plan hunts. You see it in how they craft tools. You even see it in how they look at the sky. That slow dance of the stars, was it just pretty lights? Or did someone already feel a tug of curiosity? And then something deeper begins to stir. One day someone dies. Maybe it's an elder, maybe a child, maybe someone who fell during a hunt. But instead of walking away from the body, the group does something unusual. They bury it, not just leaving it in a pit, but arranging the body carefully, maybe placing flowers, tools, or a favorite piece of carved bone near it. Why? Not for survival, but for something else. Grief, love, memory. This is the first glimmer of of symbolic thinking, of treating death not just as an end but as something that deserves meaning. It's a moment that echoes across time, because even now, tens of thousands of years later, we still do this. We still mark our grief with flowers, with ceremony, with words spoken to the sky. These people who lived so long ago might not have spoken like we do, but they felt like we do. The beginnings of art, of emotion, of reflection, they all started here. There's also a shift in how they understand each other. Communication is growing. Not just grunts or shouts anymore. Real, organized sounds begin to form. Maybe not a full language, but something close. And with communication comes cooperation, hunting in teams, dividing work, teaching the young, telling stories around the fire. That's another thing, they didn't have writing, but storytelling was already alive. A child stares into the fire, and someone older begins to mimic the motion of a mammoth charging. A low growl, a leap, a fall, everyone laughs, gasps. Not. That's how knowledge survives. Through voice, through memory. In parts of Europe, something extraordinary was happening with the Neanderthals who evolved from Homo heidelbergensis and made their home in colder regions. These weren't the dumb, slow cavemen that cartoons like to joke about. They were strong, adaptable, with brains just as big, sometimes even bigger than ours. They used complex tools. They cooked, they buried their dead. They even made art. Primitive, yes, but still art. Shells pierced and worn as necklaces. Caves stained with red ochre. These were more than decorations. They were state. I am here. I belong. I remember. And in Africa, Homo sapiens were beginning to emerge, slowly, steady. Bones and tools begin to tell a new story, a story that would one day stretch across the entire world. But for now they're still a part of this broader human family, still one thread in the web of life. Back at the camp, the hunters return. They carry meat wrapped in hides, blood still warm. The children gather close. There's laughter, relief. Tonight, they will eat well. As the sun sinks behind the hills, the fire blazes back to life. Shadows dance across the cave walls. Someone starts humming. Another claps along. It's not a song like we know, but it carries rhythm, emotion, connection. That night, as the stars come out one by one, no one speaks of the future. No one knows what will come. But in the quiet, in the warmth, in the shared breath of the firelight, something sacred lived. A memory of us, before we were fully us. A time when we were still becoming, still reaching, still remembering how to be human. The rise of Homo sapiens around 300,000 to 200,000 years ago. The wind had changed. Not just the kind that stirred through trees and swept across empty valleys, but the wind inside the human spirit. Something was waking up. Slowly, quietly, but with force. And this something had a name. Homo sapiens. It didn't happen in a single spark. There was no clear moment, no loud birth cry from the earth. It was gradual, like a sunrise that takes hours to stretch across a cold landscape. But eventually the light touched everything. Around 300,000 years ago, deep in the heart of Africa, a new kind of human was taking shape. They looked more like us than anything that came before. Their skulls were rounder, their brains were larger, highly folded, densely packed with potential. Their faces were flatter, their jaws less heavy. They were lean, smart, and capable of dreaming far beyond the campfire. It's strange to imagine them waking up to a day we could have woken up to ourselves. The same sun rising, the same dusty breeze. But what made them different wasn't just their bodies. It was how they saw the world. Inside their minds, something new was stirring. Thought wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about possibility. Imagine one of them, walking alone at dawn, bare feet pressing into soft dirt, fingers trailing along the bark of a tree, eyes wide with curiosity. They hear the call of a bird and don't just react, they pause, they wonder. This is what made Homo sapiens different. The wondering, the questions, the hunger, not just for food but for understanding. And with that came imagination. They could picture things that didn't exist yet, a tool that hadn't been made, a path that hadn't been walked, a danger that hadn't arrived, or a world beyond the stars. These people began to live not just in the present but in the possible. They sharpened their tools with more precision. They carved bones into points, needles, fish hooks. They made tiny blades from flint shaped perfectly for cutting hides or carving wood. They began using new materials like antler and ivory and combining them with stone. They also started using symbolic expression. That's a fancy way of saying they made art. They weren't just scratching lines into rocks. They were telling stories, marking their world, leaving signs that said, "I was here." One of the most remarkable pieces of evidence comes from a cave in South Africa called Blombos Cave. Inside, archaeologists found small pieces of ochre, reddish mineral pigment, with deliberate patterns carved into them. Cross-hatch lines, grids, not useful for hunting, not helpful for cooking, just human. Elsewhere they began to decorate themselves. Shell beads, smeared ochre, feathers tucked into twisted hair. What? To belong, to feel beautiful, to mean something. Clothing became more than just protection from the cold. It became a reflection of identity. As this new way of being bloomed across Africa, Homo sapiens started doing something bold. They moved. They followed the rhythm of the seasons, the curve of the rivers, the paths of the herd. One step at a time, they left footprints farther and farther from where they'd begun. And around 200,000 years ago, they began to leave Africa entirely. Imagine the courage that took to step away from the known, to face mountains no one had climbed, oceans no one had crossed, creatures they'd never seen, skies that looked unfamiliar, but they went anyway. Small groups, not armies, families, not nations. They moved in trickles, not waves. But those trickles were rivers of history. Some traveled north into the deserts of the Middle East, others pushed into the forests of Europe, some made their way into Asia. Eventually they would reach Australia, the Americas, and the islands of the Pacific. But that comes later. Right now, let's stay close, because what mattered most in this chapter was us becoming us. And one of the biggest signs of that was language. No one knows exactly when spoken language began. It left no fossil, no footprint, but somewhere in this time, it became part of life. Real language, not just sounds and pointing, but grammar, structure, the power to share stories, pass down knowledge, explain the stars. This was a superpower. With language, we could coordinate better hunts. We could teach children without them watching us. We could talk about things not in front of us, danger far away, dreams of next season. And with language, we could tell stories. That's what really changed everything. Around the fire at night, someone would speak. Maybe with gestures, maybe with voice. They'd tell of a hunt long ago, or a great river they once saw, or a creature with glowing eyes that stalked them from the dark. Did it all really happen? Maybe, maybe not. But it mattered. But it mattered. Stories became maps. They carried wisdom. They taught without bruises. And then came ritual. People began to mark transitions. A birth, a death, a first kill, a change in the moon. They gathered for reasons beyond food, to remember, to give thanks, to hope. And in those gatherings, music began. Not from instruments at first, but from the body, clapping, humming, stamping. Then came flutes, carved from bird bones, drums made from stretched skin, rattles from seeds and shells. Music was more than entertainment. It was connection. It made the group feel like one. Art, language, music, ritual. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were living. And something else remarkable happened. We started to care for the weak. Fossils from this time show healed bones, injuries that would have been fatal unless others helped. People who couldn't walk but lived for years after being hurt. That means their group stayed close, brought them food, protected them. Why? Because by now compassion was part of the human story. Not just strength, not just speed, but kindness. We were no longer just animals chasing survival. We were something more. And as this fire of awareness burned brighter, we began to change the world around us. Not just reacting to nature but shaping it. Finding the best flint and making camps near it. Using fire not just for warmth, but to cook, to clear land, to protect the night. Choosing where to sleep, where to travel, where to return. The world was still wild, but now we had a... By the end of this chapter, Homo sapiens were on the rise. Neanderthals still roamed Europe. Denisovans lived in parts of Asia. Other hominins were still scattered in pockets. But we were spreading, growing, thinking. A species with memory, with vision, with fire in both hands and hearts. And as the night sky stretched above them, maybe someone looked up at the stars and whispered to another, "There's more." And they were right. So much more was coming. But the most important part of the story had already begun. Us. The migration begins around 100,000 to 60,000 years ago. There comes a moment in every great journey when someone, maybe quietly, maybe boldly, takes the first real step away from home. For Homo sapiens, that moment was somewhere between 100,000 and 60,000 years ago. The world was huge, wild, and unknown, but something within us stirred and pushed us beyond the lands we had always known. It wasn't a stampede. It wasn't a dramatic escape or a desperate dash away from danger. It was quieter, like the tide pulling out, like a breeze nudging seeds from their branches. One group would wander a little farther, then another, then another, then another, until a slow, steady wave of humans began to spread across the planet. And it all started in Africa. Africa had been our cradle for hundreds of thousands of years. It was where we had learned to walk, to talk, to make fire, to dream. But by this time, some of us were beginning to follow rivers that bent north, trails of game that led through the green corridors of the Nile and the Red Sea. Some took ancient paths through the Horn of Africa, while others stepped out toward the Sinai. The weather played a huge role. Climate wasn't. It shifted in long, slow rhythms, like the beat of a giant drum. When Africa was greener and wetter, food was more abundant, and the land felt generous. But when dry periods arrived, when lakes shrank and grasslands turned brittle, groups had to move to survive. Those early migrants didn't know they were rewriting history. They weren't explorers or conquerors. They were just family. Hunters, gatherers, wanderers. They followed animals. They chased rains. They remembered places that had once been good to them. Crossing out of Africa may have been as simple as walking across shallow waters during a dry spell. The Bab el-Mandab Strait between East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, which now seems wide and deep, may have been narrow and walkable back then. A lucky group may have found their way across by chance, curiosity, or need. And once they crossed, everything changed. The new lands were strange. The plants looked different. The animals had never been seen before. The air might have even smelled different. There were no maps, no guides, no welcome signs. But the humans kept moving. The Middle East was one of the first big regions they reached. The Levant, the area around modern-day Israel, Lebanon, Syria, was a crossroads of sorts. Here the first modern humans may have met others who had taken root in the land long before them. One of those others was the Neanderthals. They weren't like the monsters of myth or the caveman cartoons. They were human, just a different kind. Stockier, tougher, built for cold and survival. Their eyes carried stories of snow and struggle. What happened when Homo sapiens met Neanderthals? We don't know the full story, but the bones and the genes tell us something amazing. We didn't just fight, we connected, we mingled, we had children. Today, many people around the world still carry Neanderthal. That means love, or something like it, crossed that ancient gap. But even as some stayed and mixed, others kept moving. Eastward, always eastward, through dry plains and forests, across hills and valleys. Over generations, groups made their way into Central Asia, then into South Asia. In India, humans encountered lush rivers and dense forests, but also challenges, floods, predators, diseases they didn't yet understand. Still, they adapt. They learned the new landscape. They found new foods, new medicines, new ways to live. Tools evolved. Instead of just flint blades, we see more diversity: scrapers, borers, points for different tasks. The toolkit became specialized, like a traveler packing for anything. Clothing changed too. The farther north people went, the colder it got. They learned to layer animal skins, to sew with sinew, to make boots and cloaks. But one of the biggest leaps happened when humans reached Southeast Asia, and eventually Australia. Yes, Australia. That happened earlier than most people realize. Evidence shows that humans reached the Australian continent around 65,000 years ago, which means they didn't just walk, they had to cross water. Think about that for a second. No boats, no maps, no compass, just a raft of logs maybe, or some animal skins tied together. And the courage to look across the ocean and say, let's try. That's what humans do. We try. In Australia, they found creatures unlike anything else on Earth. Giant marsupials, enormous flightless birds, kangaroos taller than a man. The Aboriginal peoples, descendants of those early settlers, developed deep spiritual connections to the land, sky, and stories that spanned tens of thousands of years. Meanwhile, back in Europe, another migration was unfolding. Homo sapiens pushed into the cold, harsh lands where Neanderthals had long ruled. It was not an easy place. Ice sheets loomed in the north. Winters were brutal. But our ancestors adapted. They used fire better. They built shelters. They wore layered clothing. And they painted. In places like Chauvet and Lascaux caves in France, early humans left behind stunning art. Images of bison, lions, horses etched and painted with ochre and charcoal. Not just random doodles, but powerful, graceful forms. Full of movement, full of life. Why did they paint? Maybe to teach, maybe to worship, maybe to remember. Whatever the reason, it tells us something loud and clear. These people felt. They remembered. They created. By this point, Homo sapiens had become unstoppable. They had learned to adapt to almost anything. Cold, heat, forest, desert. Wherever they went, they carried something precious. Not gold, not treasure, knowledge. They remembered which berries were safe, which animals to hunt, which stones made the best blades. They taught their children. They passed down songs and warnings. They began to carry not just their tools but their stories. And with each new migration, each new generation, the map of human history grew richer. By the end of this chapter, Homo sapiens were living across Africa, the Middle East, parts of Europe, all the way into South Asia and Australia. The Americas hadn't been reached yet. That would come later. But already humans had become a global species. Not many in number, perhaps only a few tens of thousands scattered across the earth. But what they lacked in population, they made up for in something far more powerful. Resilience, adaptability, creativity, and above all, curiosity. That's what made the migration happen. Not just need, but the quiet voice inside that wondered, what's out there? It's the same voice that would later build canoes, pyramids, cities, and satellites. The voice of us. And it was already singing, softly, as we stepped out of Africa and into the wide open world. The age of innovation, around 40,000 to 30,000 years ago, the world had changed. After tens of thousands of years of wandering, Homo sapiens were no longer just survivors. They were creators, innovators, and in the quiet corners of caves, along the edges of forests, in the shadow of the stars, they began to craft a new world. This was the age of innovation, a time when the human imagination started to stretch its wings in ways that would define the future. Around 40,000 years ago, humans had spread to every corner of the old world: Africa, Europe, Asia, and even the far reaches of Oceania. But it wasn't just their reach that had expanded, it was their minds. The tools they used, the stories they told, and the ways they thought about the world all began to take on new dimensions. In Europe, it was a time of extraordinary creativity. The caves of Lascaux and Chauvet, famous for their ancient paintings, are just one example of the burst of artistic expression that defined this period. But it wasn't just the art that was new, it was the way humans were beginning to think about their place in the world. The paintings themselves were stunning, no doubt. Bison, horses, mammoths, and other animals leapt to life on the cave walls, captured in a way that suggested a deep connection between the artists and the creatures they portrayed. The strokes of ochre and charcoal weren't just images, they were stories. Stories of hunting, stories of survival, but more than that, they were stories of something more profound, of the relationship between humans and nature. In these caves, people were not just showing how they lived, they were showing what they believed. To the people of Lascaux and Chauvet, these animals were more than just food sources. They were spirit. They were part of a much larger world, a world where the physical and spiritual were deeply intertwined. There's something deeply moving about the way these ancient people viewed the world, not as a collection of separate parts, but as a web of interconnections, of life and death, of spirits and matter. And it wasn't just the art that was changing. Tools were becoming more refined, more specialized. The early crude stone tools that had served the first humans so well were being replaced by tools that were finely made and purposefully designed. The flint blades and scrapers had given way to a new generation of tools that were sharper, more efficient, and more versatile. For the first time, humans were making tools for very specific tasks. They were crafting delicate needles for sewing clothes. They were creating fishhooks for catching food from rivers and lakes. They were shaping tools to carve wood, to make fire, and to hunt with precision. The technology was growing, but so too was the way humans thought about the world. In fact, the development of tools is closely tied to the development of thought. As humans learned to make better tools, they began to solve problems in more creative ways. No longer were they simply reacting to the world around them. They were changing, they were shaping it. One of the most significant innovations of this time was the invention of the bow and arrow. This simple yet revolutionary tool changed the way humans hunted, allowing them to take down prey from a distance. It was a breakthrough that allowed humans to hunt in ways that had never been possible before. With the bow and arrow, humans could hunt large game from a safe distance, reducing the risk of injury and allowing them to target animals that were previously too dangerous or elusive. The bow and arrow represented something deeper than just a hunting tool. It was a symbol of the growing intelligence and ingenuity of Homo sapiens. It showed that humans were not just reacting to the environment, they were actively shaping it. They were learning to control their surroundings, to bend nature to their will. This ability to manipulate the environment was a defining characteristic of the age of innovation. Homo sapiens were not just adapting to the world, they were transforming it. They were clearing forests, cultivating plants, and changing the very landscape around them. And in doing so, they were setting the stage for the even greater changes to come. But the age of innovation wasn't just about tools and art, it was also a time of profound social change. As human groups grew larger, they needed new ways to organize and communicate. The earliest forms of language began to emerge more clearly during this period. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly when language fully developed, but evidence suggests that Homo sapiens were beginning to use complex vocalizations and gestures to convey meaning. They were no longer just grunting or pointing, they were starting to share ideas, to tell stories. This new capacity for communication likely had profound effects on social organization. As people began to cooperate in larger groups, they needed to coordinate their efforts in ways that required language. They needed to plan hunts, share resources, and resolve conflict. And as they shared stories around the fire, they also began to shape their collective identities. This is when religion, in its earliest form, likely began to take shape. The spiritual beliefs of these early humans were deeply tied to their understanding of the natural world. The animals they hunted, the plants they gathered, and the stars above them were all part of a larger cosmic order. This was a time when the lines between the physical and spiritual worlds were blurred, and humans saw themselves as part of a much larger, interconnected web of life. As humans began to reflect more on the world around them, they also began to ask bigger questions. Where did they come from? Why did the sun rise and set? What happened after death? These were the kinds of questions that sparked the birth of religion, the birth of rituals, and the birth of myth. One of the key markers of the age of innovation was the development of burial practices. As humans began to bury their dead, they were signaling that they had a deeper understanding of life and death. They were acknowledging that death was not just an end but a transition. In some places, humans began to bury their dead with tools, weapons, and even food, suggesting that they believed in some form of afterlife, where these items would be needed. These early burial practices were not just about survival, they were about memory. They were about honoring the dead and ensuring that the stories of those who had passed on were not forgotten. They were about creating a connection between the living and the dead, between the past and the future. In the midst of all this innovation, it's easy to forget that humans were still living in a world that could be harsh and unpredictable. The Ice Age had not yet fully passed, and the world was still cold in many places. Mammoths and woolly rhinos roamed the earth, and early humans had to contend with predators that were just as skilled at hunting as they were. Life was fragile. It always had been. But the human spirit, ever adaptable, ever resilient, had found a way forward. As they faced the challenges of survival, they also found ways to make life more meaningful. They built, they painted, they crafted tools, they told stories, and they began to question the very nature of existence. The age of innovation was a time when humans began to realize their own potential. They were no longer just animals living on the edge of survival. They were artists, philosophers, and creators. They were shaping their world, their culture, and their future. It was also a time when the seeds of something greater were being sown. The innovations of this period laid the groundwork for the rise of agriculture, the development of cities, and the birth of civilization itself. But those stories, those chapters, were yet to be written. For now, the age of innovation was enough. And so, as the Ice Age slowly began to recede and the world began to warm, Homo sapiens stood on the precipice of something extraordinary. The journey was far from over, but they had made it this far, and they would continue to innovate, adapt, and dream. What lay ahead was the next great leap, a leap that would take humanity even further. The dawn of agriculture, around 10,000 to 8,000 years ago. As the last remnants of the Ice Age faded into history, the Earth began to warm. The glaciers that once stretched across much of the northern hemisphere melted, and with that change came a new world. The landscape was slowly transforming, becoming lush and fertile, a paradise waiting to be discovered. It was here, at this turning point in time, that one of the most significant shifts in human history began to take shape. This was the dawn of agriculture. The story of how humans transitioned from being wandering hunter-gatherers to settled farmers is one of the most remarkable transformations in history. It didn't happen overnight, nor did it happen in just one place. Rather, it was a gradual process that unfolded over thousands of years, with different groups of people in different parts of the world discovering new ways to harness the power of the land. It all started with the natural world itself. With the retreat of the glaciers, many parts of the earth became more hospitable. Fertile soils, warm temperatures, and abundant rainfall made certain regions ideal for the growth of plants. The wild grasses, trees, and shrubs that had once been part of the natural landscape began to thrive in new and more productive ways. The climate was changing, and with it, the opportunities for survival were shifting as well. For thousands of years, humans had lived as hunter-gatherers, moving from place to place, following herds of animals and collecting wild plants for food. It was a way of life that worked well for small groups, but as human populations grew and the world's resources became more stretched, it became increasingly difficult to sustain this lifestyle. There was a growing need for a more reliable source of food, something that would allow humans to stay in one place for longer periods and build more permanent communities. In the Fertile Crescent, a region that stretches from modern-day Turkey to Iraq, people began to experiment with planting seeds. They didn't realize it at the time, but what they were doing was changing the course of history. At first, it was likely accidental. People may have noticed that plants they ate, grains, legumes, and fruits, sometimes grew in abundance where the seeds had fallen. Over time, they began to understand that by scattering seeds near their settlements, they could encourage more plants to grow. This marked the very beginning of agriculture, but it wasn't just planting seeds that marked this change. Humans also began to domesticate animals. No longer did they need to hunt and gather all their food. They could raise animals for meat, milk, and wool, creating a more stable food supply. The domestication of animals like goats, sheep, and cattle gave humans access to a steady source of protein and other resources. It allowed them to settle in one place and invest more in their communities. The process of domesticating plants and animals wasn't immediate. It took time, trial and error, and a great deal of observation. Humans learned how to choose the best seeds for planting, those that were larger, more nutritious, or easier to harvest. They learned to selectively breed animals that were more docile, more productive, or better suited to the human way of life. This process, known as selective breeding, would continue for thousands of years and eventually lead to the variety of crops and livestock that we have today. But what was the effect of all this on the way humans lived? For one, it led to more permanent settlement. No longer did humans need to follow the herds or move with the seasons. They could stay in one place, grow crops, and raise animals. This meant that humans could build more complex societies, with larger populations, more specialized jobs, and the beginnings of what we would later call civilization. In these early farming communities, life began to change in profound ways. There was now a more predictable and reliable food source, which meant that people could spend less time searching for food and more time doing other things. With more food came more people, and with more people came the need for organization. People needed to find ways to share resources, to protect their crops and animals, and to make decisions about how to use the land. This marked the beginning of the first forms of social organization, as humans began to settle into villages, towns, and eventually cities. At the same time, new forms of technology began to emerge. As people learned more about the land and how to cultivate it, they began to develop new tools to make farming more effective. They crafted sickles to harvest grains, hoes to dig the earth, and mortars and pestles to grind seeds into flour. These tools made it possible to produce more food with less effort, further boosting the stability of these early farming societies. But farming wasn't just about producing food, it was also about controlling the land. The shift to agriculture marked the first real step humans took toward controlling their environment, manipulating nature for their own benefit. With farming came the ability to manage resources, to store food, and to plan for the future. It was a powerful change that set the stage for future developments in agriculture, technology, and society. As people became more settled, they also began to build more permanent structures. In these early farming villages, people began to construct homes made of mud, brick, or stone, with thatched roofs. These homes were built close together, forming tight-knit communities. The permanence of these settlements marked a new way of living. Humans were no longer just moving through the world, they were becoming part of it. They were shaping the land around them, building homes, creating farms, and starting to form the early outlines of society. The rise of agriculture also had a profound effect on family life. In the past, people had lived in small, mobile groups, with roles that were relatively fluid and flexible. But with agriculture came the need for more stability and organization. Families began to become more structured, with clear roles for men and women. Men typically worked the fields and tended the animals, while women often managed the household and cared for children. This division of labor would continue for thousands of years and shape the way societies were organized. But the development of agriculture wasn't without its challenges. It wasn't always easy to control the land, and many farming communities faced hardships like droughts, floods, and crop failures. The new way of life was far from perfect, and it would take centuries for people to figure out how to make agriculture truly sustainable. But despite the challenges, agriculture continued to spread, and as it did, it slowly began to change the world in ways that were unimaginable just a few thousand years earlier. Over time, farming communities grew in size and complexity. Villages gave way to towns, and towns gave way to cities. As cities grew, so too did the need for more complex social structures. The first governments were formed to manage the increasing population and ensure that resources were distributed fairly. The rise of agriculture marked the beginning of social stratification, with some people gaining more power and wealth than others. But it also marked the beginning of art, science, and culture, as people had more time to explore their creativity and ideas. The dawn of agriculture wasn't just a change in the way humans lived, it was a change in the way humans thought about the world. With the ability to grow food and raise animals, came the ability to shape the world around them. Humans were no longer just at the mercy of nature, they were learning to control it. And with this newfound control came the opportunity to build a new future, one that was centered around the land, the seasons, and the cycles of life. As farming communities spread across the earth, they began to lay the foundation for the great civilizations that would follow. The shift to agriculture was the first step in a long journey that would lead to the rise of cities, the development of writing, the invention of the wheel, and the creation of empires. But those stories were still to come. For now, the dawn of agriculture marked the beginning of a new chapter in human history. It was a time of transformation, a time when humans learned to live in harmony with the land and shape their own destiny. It was a time of growth, innovation, and change. And it was a time when the future began to take shape, one seed at a time. The rise of early civilizations, around 3000 BCE to 1000 BCE. The world was changing, and so were the people who lived in it. By the time the year 3000 BCE rolled around, humankind had already experienced a number of remarkable shifts, and the process of settling into permanent communities had gained full momentum. Agriculture was no longer just a way of life. It had become the cornerstone upon which entire societies were built. The shift from nomadic existence to settled farming had paved the way for new developments in governance, technology, culture, and trade. But the most significant change was still ahead: the rise of early civilizations. As farming communities grew, so did their need. With populations increasing and settlements becoming more permanent, people found that they needed systems of organization to manage their resources, protect their territories, and maintain order. This was where the concept of cities began to emerge. No longer just small villages, these cities were centers of culture, power, and innovation. They were places where agriculture, trade, religion, and governance intersected, shaping the future of human societies. The first great civilization to arise in human history was that of Mesopotamia, in the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This area, often referred to as the cradle of civilization, was home to some of the earliest complex societies on Earth. The Sumerians, who lived in this fertile region around 3000 BCE, were the first people to develop writing, organized religion, and large-scale cities. Their city-states, such as Ur, Uruk, and Lagash, were marvels of engineering and urban planning. These cities had impressive walls to protect them from invaders, as well as advanced irrigation systems to bring water to the fields. The Sumerians' achievements in architecture, literature, and law laid the foundation for the civilizations that would follow. But what truly set these early cities apart was the concept of governance. In these cities, rulers were not just powerful individuals, they were considered to be divinely appointed. The Sumerians believed their kings were chosen by the gods to maintain order and protect the people. This connection between religion and governance would become a hallmark of many early civilizations. The rulers of Mesopotamia, like those of Egypt and other regions, were often seen as the intermediary between the gods and the people, tasked with ensuring prosperity and averting disaster. The development of writing in Mesopotamia was equally significant. The Sumerians used a system known as cuneiform, which involved pressing wedge-shaped marks into clay tablets. This writing system allowed them to keep records of everything from trade transactions to religious texts. It was a revolutionary development, for it enabled people to communicate over long distances and record their thoughts and ideas for future generations. Writing would go on to play a crucial role in the development of all subsequent civilizations. But while Mesopotamia was flourishing, other parts of the world were also experiencing significant changes. To the west, in the Nile Valley, another great civilization was emerging: ancient Egypt. Unlike the city-states of Mesopotamia, Egypt was unified under a single ruler, the pharaoh. The pharaoh, like the kings of Mesopotamia, was believed to be a living god, responsible for maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order of the universe. Egypt's early civilization was built around the annual flooding of the Nile River, which deposited rich silt onto the land and allowed farmers to grow abundant crops. This natural cycle of fertility and abundance made Egypt a powerful and prosperous kingdom, one that lasted for thousands of years. The Egyptians, like the Sumerians, built impressive cities, but they also created monumental structures that would become the hallmark of their civilization. The pyramids of Giza, constructed during the 4th dynasty, around 3500 BCE, are perhaps the most iconic of all ancient Egyptian achievements. These massive stone structures were built as tombs for the pharaohs, and their construction required vast resources and advanced engineering tech. The pyramids were not just feats of architecture, They were symbolic of the Egyptians' belief in the afterlife, and they represented the pharaoh's divine power and eternal rule. But what truly made early civilizations like Mesopotamia and Egypt stand out was their ability to develop complex social structures. As cities grew larger and more sophisticated, so too did the divisions of labor. In these early civilizations, people didn't just grow crops or raise animals. They also became craftsmen, traders, scribes, priests, and soldiers. Some people became so wealthy and powerful that they could control entire regions, while others were forced into slavery or serfdom. The emergence of these social hierarchies marked a major shift in the way humans lived, and it would become a defining feature of nearly all subsequent civilizations. Along with these social changes came the development of trade. As cities grew, they became centers of commerce, and people began to trade goods not just with their neighbors but with distant lands. Mesopotamia, for example, traded grain and textiles with Egypt, while Egypt traded gold and papyrus with regions further to the south. The establishment of trade routes and the exchange of goods fostered cultural diffusion. Ideas, technologies, and traditions spread across the ancient world, contributing to the growth of civilizations. Around the same time that Mesopotamia and Egypt were flourishing, other great civilizations were rising elsewhere in the world. In the Indus Valley, modern-day Pakistan and northwest India, the Harappan civilization emerged around 2600 BCE. The Harappans built well-planned cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, with advanced drainage systems and a system of writing that remains undeciphered to this day. The Harappan civilization was known for its impressive urban planning, sophisticated craftsmanship, and extensive trade network. Though much about the Harappans remains mysterious, it is clear that they were an advanced society that played a key role in the development of early civilization. In China, the early foundations of civilization were also taking shape. By around 2000 BCE, the Xia dynasty had established itself as one of the first known Chinese dynasties. While much of the early history of China remains shrouded in legend, archaeological evidence suggests that the Xia, and later the Shang dynasty, around 1600 BCE, developed sophisticated systems of governance, writing, and metallurgy. The Chinese were also among the first to use bronze for tools and weapons, a technological breakthrough that would have a lasting impact on their civilization. All around the world, early civilizations were developing their own unique cultures and systems. In Mesoamerica, the Olmec civilization began to take shape around 1200 BCE, and in the Andes, the Norte Chico civilization was rising. These civilizations, while geographically isolated from one another, shared many common features, such as the development of writing, religion, and centralized governance, and they laid the groundwork for the great empires that would follow. As these early civilizations developed, they also faced challenges. The complexity of society brought with it new problems, such as the need to control resources, protect borders, and manage growing populations. The early civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley would all experience periods of decline caused by factors such as invasions, environmental changes, and internal strife. But despite these setbacks, the innovations of these civilizations, such as writing, law, and trade, would have a lasting impact on the development of human society. The rise of early civilizations marked a turning point in human history. No longer were people scattered across the land in small, isolated tribes. They were coming together to form powerful and complex societies. The development of cities, writing, religion, and trade laid the foundation for the great empires that would rise in the centuries to come. These civilizations were not just about survival, they were about building something greater, something that would endure for generations. The legacy of these early civilizations can still be felt today. The achievements of the Sumerians, Egyptians, Harappans, and others shaped the course of human history and provided the foundation for the world we live in now. The rise of these civilizations was a testament to human ingenuity, determination, and the desire to create something lasting, a legacy that continues to influence us in ways both big and small. The Age of Empires, 1000 BCE to 500 CE. The world was no longer a collection of scattered tribes and city-states. By the time we reached 1000 BCE, The pace of human progress had accelerated rapidly, and new forces were emerging. It was no longer enough for people to live in cities and farm the land. The next step was the creation of large, powerful empires, vast political entities that could control vast stretches of land, command immense resources, and assert their dominance over other societies. This was the age of empires, a time when the art of governance, war, and culture would be reshaped in dramatic ways. It all began in the Near East, where the Assyrian Empire paid to rise around 1000 BCE. The Assyrians were a military powerhouse. With their superior weaponry, tactics, and disciplined army, they quickly began expanding their territory across Mesopotamia and beyond. They built massive cities, such as Nineveh, which became a center of culture and power. Assyrian kings like Tiglath-Pileser III and Assurbanipal were known for their ruthless military campaigns, but they also invested heavily in infrastructure, creating impressive palaces, libraries, and roads that connected the empire. They were the first to truly understand the power of propaganda, using their military victories to project strength and inspire fear among their enemies. While the Assyrians were building an empire in the east, the Egyptians were facing their own challenges to maintain their dominance in the Nile Valley. The new kingdom of Egypt, which had reached its peak several centuries earlier, began to decline around 1000 BC. Though the pharaohs remained powerful figures, the empire began to fracture as rival groups gained power. Despite this decline, Egypt's cultural and technological achievements continued to influence the surrounding regions for centuries to come. The enduring legacy of the Egyptians, their architecture, art, and religious traditions would continue to inspire later civilizations. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, the Greeks were beginning to carve out their own place in the world. By 800 BCE, the Greeks had begun establishing colonies along the coasts of Italy, Sicily, and Asia Minor. These colonies were not just trading hubs, they were the seeds of a new civilization. The Greeks' intellectual pursuits, particularly in philosophy, mathematics, and the arts, would lay the foundation for Western civilization as we know it today. Cities like Athens and Sparta became the models of Greek society, each with its own unique culture, values, and political system. Athens was the birthplace of democracy, a revolutionary system of governance that would influence generations to come. Sparta, on the other hand, was a military society that valued discipline and strength above all else. The rivalry between these two city-states would shape Greek politics and warfare for centuries. By 500 BCE, the Greek world had united under the leadership of Athens to confront the mighty Persian Empire. The Persian Empire, led by kings like Cyrus the Great and Darius, was one of the most powerful and expansive empires of the ancient world. The Persians controlled a vast territory that stretched from the Indus Valley in the east to Egypt and Anatolia in the west. But despite their size and power, the Persians struggled to subdue the fiercely independent Greek city-state. The Greeks, with their love of freedom and democratic ideals, stood in defiance of Persian attempts to bring them into their empire. The wars between Greece and Persia, known as the Persian Wars, would ultimately shape the future of both civilizations. In the end, it was the Greeks who emerged victorious, defeating the Persians in iconic battles such as the Battle of Marathon and the Battle of Salamis. After the defeat of the Persians, the Greeks entered a period of cultural flourishing known as the Classical Age. This was a time of great intellectual, artistic, and architectural achievement. The philosopher Socrates, along with his students Plato and Aristotle, laid the foundations of Western philosophy. Playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides wrote masterpieces that would be performed for centuries. The Parthenon, built on the Acropolis of Athens, remains one of the most enduring symbols of ancient Greek achievement. The Greeks also made significant advances in science, mathematics, and medicine, with figures like Pythagoras, Euclid, and Hippocrates revolutionizing their respective fields. It was during this time that the Greek language and culture spread far and wide, influencing much of the ancient world. But even as the Greeks were reaching the height of their power, a new force was rising in the east. In the 4th century BCE, a young Macedonian king named Alexander the Great began his conquest of the known world. Alexander's empire stretched from Greece all the way to India, and his military genius was unmatched. His armies swept through Persia, Egypt, and the Indian subcontinent, leaving behind a legacy of cultural exchange and blending. The Hellenistic period, which followed Alexander's death, saw the spread of Greek culture across Asia and the Mediterranean. The result was a fusion of Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and Indian influences, creating a new cosmopolitan world that would influence the development of future empires. While the Greeks were building their cultural and intellectual legacy, the Romans were rising to power on the Italian peninsula. Rome began as a small city-state, but by the 1st century BCE, it had transformed into one of the most powerful empires the world had ever known. The Romans, like the Greeks, were deeply influenced by Greek culture, but they also developed their own unique approach to governance, warfare, and law. The Roman Republic, established in 509 BCE, was a system of government that blended elements of democracy, aristocracy, and monarchy. The Romans were skilled military strategists, and their armies were among the most disciplined and effective in history. The Roman legions conquered vast swaths of territory, from Britain in the northwest to Egypt in the southeast. By the time of Julius Caesar, Rome had become the dominant power in the Mediterranean world. The rise of Rome marked the beginning of a new phase in the Age of Empires. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, his adopted heir, Octavian, later Augustus, became the first emperor of Rome. Under Augustus, the Roman Empire was firmly established, and it would go on to dominate the Mediterranean world for the next 5 centuries. Augustus ushered in an era of relative peace, known as the Pax Romana, during which the empire expanded to its greatest extent. The Romans built roads, aqueducts, and cities that stretched from the British Isles to the sands of Egypt. Roman law, which emphasized justice, citizenship, and civic duty, became the foundation for many legal systems in the Western world. But even as the Roman Empire was at its height, cracks began to appear. The empire grew so large and unwieldy that it became difficult to manage. In the 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire began to experience economic decline, political instability, and external threats from barbarian tribes. In 47–6 CE, the Western Roman Empire finally fell, marking the end of the classical era. However, the Eastern Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, would continue for another 1,000 years, preserving much of the knowledge, culture, and institutions of the ancient world. The Age of Empires had seen the rise and fall of some of the greatest civilizations in history. It was a time of war, conquest, and cultural exchange, and the legacies of these empires would continue to shape the course of human history. The empires of the ancient world had shown humanity what was possible when power, governance, and culture came together in a single, unified vision. But the fall of these empires also reminded people of the fragility of greatness and of how quickly the tides of history can change. The fall and transformation of empires 500 CE to 1000 CE. The ancient world had known its empires powerful, vast, and rich with culture and achievement. But by the year 500 CE, something significant had begun to shift. The great empires of antiquity, which had stretched across continents and connected distant peoples, were starting to crumble. The fall of these mighty civilizations didn't happen overnight, but over the course of several centuries. The reasons were varied: economic troubles, political instability, invasions by barbarian tribes, and internal strife all played their parts in the unraveling of once great powers. But in their wake, something new emerged. The old empires had fallen, but new kingdoms, cultures, and political systems began to rise, marking the beginning of the medieval era, a time of transformation, reinvention, and renewal. At the heart of this dramatic change was the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 47–6. The Roman Empire had endured for nearly 5 centuries, but it had become too vast, too complex, and too overextended to manage. The empire's borders were under constant threat from Germanic tribes, such as the Visigoths, Vandals, and Ostrogoths, who had been pushing into Roman territory for decades. Economic collapse, political corruption, and a weakened military all contributed to the empire's downfall. In 47 CE, the last Roman emperor in the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic leader Odoacer, marking the official end of the Western Roman Empire. Though the Eastern Roman Empire or Byzantine Empire continued for another 1,000 years, the West would enter a period of profound change and decline. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not the end of civilization, but it was the beginning of a new chapter. Europe, now divided into smaller kingdoms and territories, faced a long period of instability. In the absence of Roman order and infrastructure, much of the former Roman territories fell into what historians later referred to as the Dark Ages. During this time, the great cities of the Roman world, like Rome, Alexandria and Carthage, declined and were abandoned. The knowledge of Roman engineering, architecture and administration was lost, and much of the learning of the classical world was forgotten or preserved only in fragments. But as Europe fell into chaos, a new power was rising in the East, the Byzantine Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, had managed to survive the collapse of its Western counterpart. The Byzantines continued to consider themselves Romans, and they maintained much of the old Roman traditions. They preserved Roman law, and their emperors ruled with the same authority as their predecessors in Rome. The Byzantine Empire, however, was different from the old Roman Empire. It was more Greek in culture, more Christian in religion, and more focused on trade and diplomacy. The Byzantines became known for their art, literature, and learning, and their influence spread throughout the Mediterranean world. Despite the decline of the West, Europe was far from forgotten. New kingdoms began to take shape in the territories once ruled by Rome. The Frankish kingdom, for example, emerged as one of the most powerful forces in Western Europe. In the 8th century CE, the Frankish king Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, united much of Western Europe under his rule. Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans by the Pope in 800 CE, an event that symbolized the revival of the idea of a Western Roman Empire. Charlemagne's reign was marked by efforts to revive learning, rebuild infrastructure, and spread Christianity throughout his empire. His empire, known as the Carolingian Empire, became a precursor to the Holy Roman Empire, which would dominate much of Central Europe for centuries. But while Charlemagne's empire was a bright moment in the Dark Ages, it too was fragile. After Charlemagne's death in 814 CE, the Carolingian Empire was divided among his grandsons, and it soon fractured into smaller kingdoms. The division of the empire made it vulnerable to external threats, and by the 9th century, Viking raids began to wreak havoc across Europe. The Vikings, seafaring Norsemen from Scandinavia, launched raids on coastal towns and monasteries, and their longships allowed them to strike deep into Europe's heart. These raids contributed to the further weakening of the fragmented kingdoms of Europe and led to widespread instability. At the same time, the Byzantine Empire faced its own challenges. The rise of Islam in the 7th century CE, with the rapid expansion of the Arab caliphates, posed a major threat to Byzantine territories. The Muslims captured much of the Byzantine Empire's eastern lands, including Syria, Egypt, and North Africa. In the 11th century, the Seljuk Turks, a Muslim group, also began to push into Byzantine territory, culminating in the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, where the Byzantine army was defeated. Though the Byzantine Empire would continue to survive for several more centuries, its power had been greatly diminished. In the wake of the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the decline of the Byzantine Empire, a new civilization was beginning to take shape in the Islamic world. Islam, which had emerged in the 7th century CE in the Arabian Peninsula, rapidly expanded across the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Europe. By the 8th century, the Islamic caliphates had become one of the most powerful and influential empires in the world. The Muslims established sophisticated centers of learning in cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, where scholars made advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. The Islamic world became a bridge between the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome and the medieval world. The influence of Islamic culture, science, and art would have a profound effect on the development of Europe and the rest of the world. While the decline of the ancient empires was taking place in Europe and the Mediterranean, other regions of the world were experiencing their own periods of transformation. In China, the Tang and Song dynasties were leading a period of great cultural and technological innovation. The Tang dynasty, 600–907 CE, was marked by territorial expansion, cultural exchange along the Silk Road, and a flourishing of the arts. The Song dynasty, 960–1279 CE, followed, and under its rule China saw significant advancements in science, technology, and trade. The Chinese invented paper money, created advanced printing techniques, and made important discoveries in the fields of mathematics and engineering. China became the dominant economic power in East Asia, and its culture and ideas spread to neighboring regions, including Japan and Korea. In India, the Gupta Empire, which had ruled from around 320 to 550 CE, had already fallen by the time Europe entered the Dark Ages. However, the legacy of the Gupta Empire, particularly in the fields of mathematics, astronomy, and literature, continued to influence Indian society and beyond. The period following the fall of the Gupta Empire was marked by regional kingdoms, including the Chola dynasty in the south, which maintained a strong naval presence and established trade routes throughout Southeast Asia. In Africa, the great kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai began to rise. These empires, located in West Africa, became major players in trade, particularly in gold, salt, and other valuable commodities. The city of Timbuktu in the Mali Empire became a center of learning and culture, attracting scholars, traders, and travelers from across the Muslim world. The rise of these African empires marked a new chapter in the history of the continent, and their influence would continue to shape African civilization for centuries. The fall of the Western Roman Empire, the decline of the Byzantine Empire, and the rise of new powers in Europe, Asia, and Africa all contributed to a period of transformation. The old order was breaking down, but in its place, new kingdoms, cultures, and civilizations were being forged. The period from 500 CE to 1000 CE was one of struggle but also of renewal. While much was lost, ancient knowledge, monumental cities, and powerful empires, something new and equally important was being born. The medieval world, with all its complexities and contradictions, was beginning to take shape, setting the stage for the next chapter in human history. The rise of the medieval world, 1000 CE to 1500 CE. The early medieval period, which began with the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the gradual disintegration of long-standing empires, was a time of change, upheaval, and transformation. Yet, by the 1000 CE mark, a sense of order was starting to re-emerge in many parts of the world. What had once been a fragmented and unstable landscape was slowly being knitted back together by emerging kingdoms, powerful rulers, and new systems of governance. It was in this time that the seeds of the medieval world began to take root, a world that, though shaped by the remnants of ancient civilizations, would become distinctly different from the classical past. In Europe, the Viking Age, which had seen the seafaring Norsemen raid and settle across the continent, began to fade by the 11th century. The Vikings, whose longships had struck fear into the hearts of countless communities, had by now settled into new territories, including England, Ireland, and parts of northern France. As their raids turned to settlement, their culture began to blend with the local societies, leaving behind a lasting impact on European culture, language, and governance. One of the most significant Viking settlements was the Kingdom of Normandy, established by Norsemen in northern France, which would later play a pivotal role in the conquest of England. The year 1066 stands as one of the most pivotal in European history. In that year, William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, crossed the English Channel and defeated King Harold II of England at the Battle of Hastings. This event marked the beginning of Norman rule in England, and it changed the course of English history forever. The Norman conquest reshaped England's political, social, and cultural landscape. The Normans brought with them feudalism, a system of governance in which land was granted in exchange for loyalty and military service. This system would become the foundation for much of medieval European society, shaping the lives of countless peasants, lords, and knights. Feudalism, while often seen as a symbol of medieval Europe, was not unique to the region. Across the continent, various forms of feudal systems were taking shape. In France, the Carolingian Empire's disintegration had led to the rise of powerful local lords who ruled over vast estates and had the loyalty of armies of knights and peasants. These lords often found themselves in conflict with one another, leading to the creation of a patchwork of small kingdoms and duchies. In Spain, the Reconquista, the centuries-long effort by Christian kingdoms to reclaim territory from the Muslim Moors, was in full swing. By 1492, the final Muslim stronghold of Granada fell to the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, completing the Reconquista and unifying Spain under Christian rule. Meanwhile, the Holy Roman Empire, a patchwork of territories in Central Europe, was emerging as one of the most significant political entities of the time. The Holy Roman Empire, which had been established by Charlemagne in 800 CE, was in a state of flux during the medieval period. Though the title of emperor was nominally inherited through a line of rulers, the real power often lay with individual kings and princes who ruled their territories with considerable autonomy. Over time, the Holy Roman Empire's political structure became increasingly decentralized as local rulers grew more powerful and independent. Nevertheless, the idea of the Holy Roman Empire persisted, symbolizing a connection to the legacy of ancient Rome and the Christian faith, and providing a sense of unity across a diverse and fragmented region. But it was not only in the realm of politics that the medieval world began to take shape. In the 11th and 12th centuries, a great intellectual revival occurred across Europe. This period, known as the Renaissance of the 12th century, saw the rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman texts that had been preserved by Islamic scholars in the Middle East. These texts, which included works on philosophy, science, mathematics, and medicine, began to make their way into Europe. Scholars, particularly in centers of learning like the University of Bologna, began to translate these texts into Latin, sparking a revival of classical knowledge that would influence European thought for centuries to come. Alongside this intellectual revival, the Catholic Church played an ever-growing role in shaping the medieval world. The Christian Church, with its vast network of bishops, monks, and priests, was not only a religious institution, but also a political and cultural force. The Pope, seated in Rome, wielded tremendous power over European rulers, often serving as a mediator in disputes between kings and lords. The Church's influence was particularly strong during the Crusades, a series of religious wars fought between Christians and Muslims over control of Jerusalem and other holy sites. Beginning in 1095, Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade, urging Christians to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. Though the Crusades were marked by periods of violence and bloodshed, they also led to the exchange of ideas, goods, and technologies between the East and West. By the 13th century, the medieval world had become a place where art, culture, and learning flourished. The Gothic architectural style, with its soaring cathedrals and intricate stained glass windows, became the hallmark of medieval Europe. The construction of cathedrals, such as Notre Dame in Paris and Chartres Cathedral in France, symbolized the power and grandeur of the Christian faith. At the same time, literature began to take on new forms, with epic poems like the Song of Roland and the Divine Comedy capturing the imagination of medieval audiences. In literature, as in architecture, there was a blend of the classical and the new, with Christian themes incorporated into the traditions of Greco-Roman storytelling. The 14th century, however, brought with it a series of calamities that tested the resilience of the medieval world. The Black Death, which swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351, killed an estimated one-third of the population. The plague had a profound impact on European society, disrupting economies, weakening kingdoms, and shifting the balance of power between lords and peasants. The labor shortages caused by the plague led to demands for higher wages and peasants began to challenge the traditional feudal order. At the same time, the church's authority was questioned as people sought answers to the cause of the plague, which they believed to be a divine punishment. The rise of new ideas in the 15th century heralded the end of the medieval period and the beginning of the Renaissance. The Renaissance, which began in Italy in the 14th century, was marked by a renewed interest in classical antiquity, humanism, and artistic innovation. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo produced works that celebrated the human form and intellect, while philosophers such as Petrarch and Erasmus explored new ideas about the nature of humanity and society. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440, revolutionized the spread of knowledge, making books more accessible and affordable to a wider audience. The Renaissance would lead to the exploration of new lands, the rise of powerful monarchies, and the eventual collapse of feudalism, marking the end of the medieval world and the beginning of the modern era. As the medieval world faded, it left behind a complex legacy of social, political, and cultural change. The medieval period was one of transformation, a time when the remnants of the classical past were reborn and reinterpreted. The world that emerged from the ashes of ancient empires was no longer the same as the one that had come before. It was a world of new ideas, new institutions, and new ways of thinking, an era that laid the foundation for the modern world. The rise of feudalism, the growth of Christianity, the resurgence of learning, and the evolution of art and culture all played their part in shaping the world that would come after. The medieval period, though often seen as a time of darkness and decline, was in fact a time of growth, innovation, and transformation, a bridge between the ancient and the modern, between the old and the new.